Right, the Air France crash was an absolute tragedy, and basically it's like any aircraft crash. It was a whole series of things that led to the final tragedy. It was not just one single thing that caused it. Typical aircraft accident. That's almost invariably the case with any aircraft crash. It's always a combination, a chain of events, an error chain of events, and it's that crucial combination of all those errors that leads to the final tragedy. And this crash was no exception. First of all, the airplane had been in maintenance 2 or 3 days before, and the left-hand undercarriage had got some sort of a problem with it, and they'd stripped it all down to its component parts, and in the process of reassembling that left-hand undercarriage, the ground engineers failed to put back into that undercarriage a component that you can't detect. The flight engineer, for instance, on that day would not have been able to see whether or not this component was missing. It's a thing called a spacer that runs between the left-hand and right-hand pair of wheels on the undercarriage truck, runs laterally across from one side to the other of that undercarriage truck to keep, as the name implies, the two pairs of wheels spaced, but also what it does is it keeps them locked in proper tracking alignment so they don't wobble around like wheels on a supermarket trolley. That component was not put back in when they reassembled that left-hand undercarriage. It was left sitting on a shelf in the Air France hangar. On the day itself, the captain decides that he wants as much fuel as possible on the airplane, and he authorizes the refuelers to override the normal refueling systems, which cut off at about 83% of tank capacity, so that you've got airspace left in the tank. He authorized that protection to be overridden and to have all the tanks in the wing completely filled up, totally filled up, no airspace in them. He also decided to take 2 tons of taxi fuel, which is a lot of fuel to take just for taxiing. So, then they had a delay because there was a problem with one of the reversers, and the captain quite correctly authorized or insisted on that reverser being fixed. And that led to about an hour's delay, an hour and a quarter's delay to the flight. So I think it's quite possible, bearing in mind that these were all passengers who were joining a cruise ship, a German cruise ship called the Deutschland, and cruise ships tend to leave on time. They don't hang around, they have to vacate their berth at the appropriate time because somebody else is coming in there. And I suppose it may have been in the back of the captain's mind, and this is pure speculation on my part, that, God, now that I've got the reversers fixed, I've really got to get on with it. No messing about. We can't hang about now. We need to get them over to New York as soon as possible. Anyway, I don't know, half an hour or so, 20 minutes before it was due to push back, up comes the dispatcher telling the captain that he's leaving 19 bags behind. Why, said the captain. Because you're overweight, he said, and therefore I'm not putting them on. No, these are passengers joining a cruise ship. They need their baggage. And you can imagine this is not lightweight baggage. These are people going on a cruise from New York through the Panama Canal to Sydney for the Sydney Olympics. So this was a trip of a lifetime. And they were going with their dinner jackets, their ball guns, and then the whole shooting match. And the captain says, is there physical space to put those bags on? And the dispatcher said, yes, we can actually put them on, but you're going to be way overweight, then your centre of gravity is going to be out. Oh, just stick them on. Won't matter. So 19 bags are now put in to the baggage hold at the back end of the aeroplane. There are 2 baggage holds on the aeroplane, one up forward, that one was full, one at the back end, and that's where those bags were put. Now, we'll never know how much they're talking at least 100 kilos, 600 kilos of weight. I think I said he opted to take 2 tons of taxi fuel. I think actually, my memories failed me here. I should have looked it up before I left home. I think it might have been 3 tons of taxi fuel. Anyway, he'd taken a hell of a lot of taxi fuel. But the upshot of it all was that when they finally taxied off from the departure gate to go to the runway, which was runway 26 right at Paris Charles de Gaulle, it was a very quiet time of day, and they ended up taxiing for about 5 or 6 minutes, and there they were at the threshold for the runway and ready for takeoff. No hold-ups at all. Suffice it to say that they had only burnt 800 kilos, and it was, I think, 3 tons they'd taken of taxi fuel. But they'd only burnt 800 kilos of it. So they'd got sort of 600 pounds of baggage at the back. All this extra fuel at the back that should have been burnt off. The airplane was something like 3 tons over the weight it should have been at when it started the takeoff. And it was also beyond the aft limits of centre of gravity. The other thing that happened on that day was that the first 200 or 300, 400 metres of the runway were technically closed because they were resurfacing work in progress, and the captain asked for permission to use that extra bit of runway because he knew that he was very heavy and he wanted as much runway as possible. And I think this is also a factor in this, because as you can imagine, between that first segment of runway, which was work in progress in terms of resurfacing, and the rest of the runway that was all a properly resurfaced runway, there was a ledge or a lip as you transitioned from one bit of the runway to the other. So just bear that in mind. So now he gets his takeoff clearance, and he's cleared for takeoff on runway 26 right, wind 080, 10 knots. Now that's taking off with a tailwind. So here this airplane that's over the maximum structural takeoff weight, with a centre of gravity that's beyond its aft limits, cleared for a takeoff with a tailwind. This effectively put the airplane about 7 or 8 tons over the weight it should have been at. Taking off with a tailwind's fine if you factored it into your calculations and reduced your weights and things accordingly. It is not fine when you're over the maximum structural takeoff weight. Absolutely not fine. I mean, there's no question about it in my mind that at that point, the co-pilot should have said, "Hey, Captain, we can't do this. We should take off in the opposite direction, take off on 08, and then we'll have a headwind and we'll have burnt off some of that fuel that we shouldn't have on board." Anyway, that didn't happen. So they start their takeoff. Nobody challenges the captain at all. No comment at all about all these wrong decisions that are going on. And I think when the airplane hit that ledge between the first bit of the runway and the rest of it that I was describing a moment ago, that it probably shuffled those wheels around on that left-hand undercarriage, because there are now very coherent reports, notably from an Air France Airbus captain who was waiting at the takeoff point a little bit further down the runway for the official length that was available, and he observed as this Concorde went past him, that there was smoke coming out from the left-hand undercarriage at a very early stage of the takeoff run, which implies that the tyres were scrubbing, not running in a proper fore and aft proper alignment. They were sort of scrubbing on the runway surface and smoking. The speeds for that, the crucial speeds, the V1 was 155 knots, the rotate was 198, and the V2 was 220. At something like 176 knots on that takeoff run, the front right-hand wheel on that left-hand undercarriage ran over this piece of metal that had been left by a Continental Airlines DC-10. It was a strip of titanium, and that strip of titanium carved off a 4.5 kilo lump of rubber, which parted company with that wheel with the velocity of a missile. I mean, the airplane was doing 200 miles an hour, 176 knots. What the rotational velocity of the wheel was, I have no idea. But it must have just left with a velocity, and it went slamming into the underside of the wing by tank number 5, just down there. And it set up a shockwave in that fuel tank, and there was nowhere for the energy in that shockwave to go. And it had to go somewhere. It was actually a burst of fuel out of the tank. It was not a penetration of rubber into the tank. And another thing, just to compound matters, was that there's a transfer valve to control the fuel in tank 11 at the back to bring pump fuel forwards or pump it back. There are booster pumps and transfer valves to enable you to do that. Those transfer valves are supposed to be shut and the booster pumps off during the takeoff run, because you don't want fuel being pumped up the length of the runway during the takeoff. He authorized, I suppose because he knew the centre of gravity was beyond the rare limits, he wanted to move the centre of gravity forwards as soon as possible. So during that takeoff, not only have we got a situation where the fuel tanks were already full because they'd been overfilled, but also any airspace that was being created in those fuel tanks was being replaced by fuel being pumped up from tank 11 at the back of the airplane into the fuel tanks in the wing. So we have already overfilled fuel tanks in the wing that were being continually topped up by fuel coming from the tail end of the airplane, which didn't help matters at all. Anyway, the airplane... Oh, the other thing I should have mentioned was that the other thing that certainly happened at this point was that the wheels on that left-hand undercarriage skewed around and actually physically steered the airplane off the left-hand side of the runway, and it actually departed onto the hard shoulder of the runway before it got airborne and hit a runway light on the way. It then got airborne, and about 25 feet radio altimeter height, there was a fire warning, and the flight engineer then carried out a fire drill on that number 2 engine without any discussion with the captain at all. The captain didn't even know that this drill was happening, and he just shut it down. And that's not something you're supposed to do. You know, if you get an engine fire during takeoff, the only vital actions you do are cancel the fire warning bell so that the noise doesn't distract you. And in Concorde's case, you select on the reheats another, I don't know that you can do it on this, no you can't. But on our airplanes, there's another setting for those reheats called contingency power, which was about another 8% of power that you got out of those reheats. So in Concorde, if you had an engine failure on takeoff, you cancel the fire bell and select contingency power on the reheats, which is another selection beyond the normal on switch for the reheats. He, as far as I know, didn't select contingency power on those reheats. And of course, the reason that the engine fire warning had come about was because this flame that was blow-torching out from tank number 5, from this hole where the fuel had burst out of the tank. And the ignition source for the fire, by the way, almost certainly was damaged wiring to the brake fans on the left-hand undercarriage, caused by these problems with the undercarriage truck. It had damaged the wiring and it was arcing. And that blowtorch of flame was going right past number 2 engine and overheating it. And that was what had caused the fire. So it wasn't an engine fire in the conventional sense of the word. It was actually an overheating of the engine caused by this blowtorch of flame that triggered off this fire warning. And the tragedy, well, it's just one element of all the several tragedies, was that the flight engineer shut this engine down uncommanded because that engine was, in fact, producing some power. It wasn't producing full power because this hot air that was coming in with the flames coming in through the intake was overheating the engine, but it was producing power. And to have that power suddenly removed certainly didn't help matters. The airplane then staggered away, and it only just missed an Air France 747 that was waiting for permission to cross the runway. It had come in on a flight from Tokyo carrying the President of France, President Chirac, who had been on a state visit, and his wife were on board. And I know this from an Air France Concorde pilot that I got to know very well. And he was telling me that his friend, who was the captain on that 747, estimates that this Concorde flew over the top of his airplane and missed him by about 20 feet.
Wow.
And I remember saying to Jean-Marie Chauve, this Concorde, Air France Concorde pilot friend of mine, I said, Jean-Marie, I think you mean 20 meters. You must mean 20 meters. No, John, he said, I do not mean 20 meters. He said, I mean 20 feet. He said, I mean 8 or 9 meters, 20 feet.
Wow.
So there we are. It narrowly missed that 747 as a result of its trajectory after it got airborne, because it had gone off to the left, steered off to the left by that problem with the undercarriage, and its trajectory when it got airborne was to the left-hand side of the runway, which is where this airplane was sitting on a taxiway waiting for permission to cross the runway to go to the arrival gate. The airplane then achieved barely 200 feet. It never reached 220 knots. And its final death throw, and bear in mind that all this fuel was hosing out of the tank number 5, which was forward of the centre of gravity. So the centre of gravity that was already beyond the rear limits was going even more rapidly rearwards because of all this fuel that was being dumped forward of the centre of gravity. And its final death throw is to rear up about 25 degrees, 30 degrees, and about 110 degrees of bank, and then crash into the hotel in Gonesse, where there was one person in the hotel that was killed, and 100 and let me get this right, 6. Oh, there are 4 people in the hotel. 113 people died altogether. 109 on the aeroplane.
That's the story.
And 4 in the hotel. Very sad story, yeah.